Welcome back. At this point, working in Eevee Next looks more and more like cycles. We'll soon see how by going over the lighting process of this foresty wooden shed environment. This is the photo scan that we're going to use, and while I set the scene up, I'll show you two renders. Let me know down below what you think is rendered by what engine. We'll break it in the end. We've got a camera view up top and 3D viewport down below. We'll disable the overlays, the gizmos and the header so that we have a clean area for the camera view. In the shading workspace, we'll set the render engine to Eevee and turn on ray tracing, which is the main determinant of global illumination. To give an ambient light, we'll start with giving some strength to the world lighting, and a tiny bit of dark green tint since this is supposed to be in the middle of a forest. If we inspect the model, there are holes at the top, which we can conveniently use to shine the light from, and they will help in breaking up the light pattern as well. So we'll add a spotlight. You'll see lighting artists in game development using them quite often because they offer a great degree of control and flexibility of the overall look. Lights falling from an angular perspective look more interesting than from top down. So we'll tilt the direction of the spotlight just a bit for it to shine over the woods placed at the left side of the camera. And we can decrease the size a bit just for visual clarity. Now once this is set up, we can move this in the y-axis to see what patterns of light look more interesting. To portray a bit of a mystery, we can keep the far side relatively darker, and this gives depth and contrast to the scene. With our usual higher light control setup, we can add an empty and set it as a target for the track 2 constraint over the light. Once that is done, we can move around the empty to change the direction of the light fall at the distal end. As a demonstration, if we bring in a reflective surface, we can see the simulated light bounce in Eevee Next in these areas. Do bear in mind that emissive objects give out a screen space lighting, meaning that if the source of light goes out of screen, the global light bounces cease to exist. We can demonstrate this by going down the tunnel like this, and you can see how it darkens as we go along. Now this distal area of the shed has zero visibility because the spotlight only illuminates the front. To give it a bit of gradual fall off, we can introduce an area light. We'll resize it to about half the depth of the shed and move it along the depth axis to see where it visually settles the best. Putting it right in the front gives the light a good gradient fall off to the back. Now because this is a direct light coming from the area light, it does not go away when the light is off the screen. In other words, direct lighting is not screen space, whereas the indirect or bounce light is. Now the model itself is very static. We need to add some props and dynamics to it to make the scene lived in. We'll start by adding foliage in selected areas. For this I use my favorite add-on for all my foliage requirements, and it's called Botanic. It has all sorts of trees, shrubs, grass, and these pre-made grass biomes that I find myself using quite a lot. I've linked the add-on in the description for you to check out. This distribution is powered by a particle system, and we can see that this foliage instantly gives character to this model, even though it's randomly distributed all over. But we do have tight control over where the assets are placed. We can do this by using weight paint method, which conveniently is present just here down below. This is now effectively a brush that you can use to paint the foliage on the surface. So we'll paint over the areas which show green grass over the photo scan to cover these low fidelity, blobby areas, and overlay them with high fidelity foliage. We can even turn on procedural wind through Botanic, but we won't be doing it here. Once we've covered the green blobby areas, we can turn down the particle count to a bit more reasonable amount that visually makes sense. Now this is how it looks in Eevee, and this is how it looks in Cycles. Do you identify any differences? Pretty close enough in my opinion, with the added advantage of real-time rendering. So we'll switch back to Eevee now and continue our scene development. So the front part here can be improved further by adding some highlights on the edges and giving it a feel as if sunlight is peering through the forest canopy. For this we duplicate the spotlight setup and place it in the front. We can now experiment with the placement of the empty for the light fall. We want it to be roughly from the same direction as the first spotlight so as to not break the light composition. But we do have freedom of moving it around as long as it does not visually deviate from the established direction of the light, which is from right to left. So earlier we talked about how angular lights look a bit more pleasing than straight head-on ones, so we can tilt this a bit lower as well. Right about here gives good edge highlights on these two structures without adding too much light into the scene. These edge highlights add in just a tiny bit more character to the lighting scenario. Stacking of these incremental improvements does make your renders stand out. So peering through a camera angle, this is how our scene is currently looking. What would you want to add next to enhance the lighting of this scene? Correct, we can add some god rays by using volumes in our scene. Let's just play around with the cube and witness those light bounces. It's a treat to watch having these occur in real time. Magnificent. So we'll do the usual exercise of increasing the size of the volume cube and giving it a principled volume shader. Volumes are a pain to solve for path tracers like cycles because there are so many bounces occurring at the same time inside the volume that it practically arrests the renderer, particularly in low-end machines. With raster engines like Eevee, volumes are calculated real-time and they don't look much different from cycles. Obviously it depends on the use case, but we'll see if you got the visual difference in volume rendering between the two engines in the end from the two render images I showed you earlier. This is a fine example of the capabilities of Eevee Next with volumes producing god rays in real time, and they are very comparable to cycles. Oftentimes we can give the volume a slight tint, either warm or cold, to split the toning of the scene and either augment the warmth or give it some cold contrast. We can do this by increasing the saturation a bit and then playing with the hue values to see what looks best. Another feature of Eevee Next is that when you use HDRIs to light the scene, the object now casts shadows, which was previously not the case, and we used to resort to alternative methods to get the shadows or downright just avoid using HDRIs. So if we now rotate the HDRI, we can see that the shadows from the structural timber are being cast on the opposite direction of the source of the light. And this proves game-changing as it makes another important method of lighting the scenes viable. If we want to use the HDRI just for the background and not have it light the scene, we can mix the HDRI node system and background together. The factor will be driven by a light path node, outputting the is camera ray into the factor. That way we can independently tweak the ambient light and move around the HDRI for background suitability. As a comparison with volume, this is with cycles. Still fairly light to solve. But this is with real-time Eevee. Speaking of real-time, we'll add more life into the scene using my real-time cloth simulation library called Cascade. It integrates really well with the asset browser and contains high-fidelity modular cloth simulations with the drag and drop function. It really makes the scene more dynamic and I find myself using it all the time in my own works. While making it, I observed hundreds of simulations that 3D artists tend to use, and it's tailored to take care of majority of these needs. You don't need to simulate anything, it's just there to pick, drag and drop, ready to go. It's available on Blender Market and you can download it from link in the description. I tend to place my 3D cursor where I want to place the cloth, then drag and drop it into the scene. I can then press Shift S and selection to cursor to move it exactly where I need it to be. We can then resize and reposition as needed. This cloth does not show up in the scene but mostly contributes to the shadow formation. We can go a step further and add another cloth at the front to break up the edge highlight and have a visual presence of a dynamic object. Same drill with placing the 3D cursor where we want the cloth to be and selection to cursor. Resizing the empty makes the cloth inherit the same transforms. While looking at the camera view, we can resize it appropriately. Not too little and not too large. Judicious use of everything does the job. Right around here looks alright. We're basically looking at the shadows over at the far edge highlight to make sure that the shadows are cast there. The library does come with some interesting cloth materials and textures, but here we'll resort to a simple diffuse material matching the surroundings. A dark beige color does go with the wood underneath and it gives it a belonging in the scene. We can increase the roughness so that it does not reflect that much of light and does not appear glossy. That will be perfect. As a final layer of imperfection, we can add dust particles with the free geometry node system that I use. I'll be sure to link it for you as well. This provides a lot of flexibility with all the parameters that you would need in a dust particle simulating system. It's not just only there for dust, you can use it to make snow, falling leaves, ambers, etc. Bear with me, we are almost there. As a final prop, we'll add this antique machinery. I like mechanical bits with rich textures because of their ability to add to the story. You can press G and Shift Z to move it along the XY axis. This does feel a lot like working and moving things around in Unreal Engine, especially with the real-time rendering. So we'll place it here where it'll receive some light from the second lamp that we made. Later in the animation, light moving from the inside also starts illuminating parts of it, which makes it a bit more interesting with the light. With this setup, I think we are ready. But just before we render, let's see if you guessed the renders right. So, the first render was from Eevee with 64 samples and 9.86 seconds of render time. The second is from Cycles with 64 samples and 44.83 seconds render time in the same resolution. Congratulations if you got it right, you are a keen observer. With everything in place and running perfectly fine, we can now start the render. After some post-processing and sound design, here is the final result. I hope this was helpful. All the project files are available on my Patreon along with some more resources. If you do struggle with lighting, I have an entire series about the mindset you should have when lighting your scenes. And it also gives you a step-by-step process to light different scenes with the direction in mind. Like and subscribe if you learned a thing or two. I'll see you soon in the next one. Farewell.